On a crisp autumn night in the remote countryside of Montana, the wind howled through the empty fields, rustling the dried corn stalks and carrying with it a chill that seeped into the bones. The full moon hung high, casting elongated shadows across the land. It was the kind of night that made silence feel heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Frank Miller sat on the front porch of his old wooden farmhouse. His calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. His weathered face, lined with years of hard living and service, remained impassive as he listened to the distant rustling of the fields. His sharp blue eyes, still keen despite his years, scanned the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. He had seen enough in his lifetime to know that nature had its own way of whispering warnings. Inside, Linda Miller moved through the dimly lit kitchen, placing a plate of freshly baked cookies onto the worn wooden table. She was a woman who had always trusted her instincts. And tonight, they whispered caution. The air inside the house felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't quite name. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending flickering shadows up the walls. But even the warmth of the flames did little to ease her unease. Their 8-year-old granddaughter, Lily, was sprawled out on the rug in front of the fire, giggling softly as she played with Ghost, the youngest of their 5 German shepherds. The little pup wagged his tail eagerly, nipping at her hands in a playful manner. Lily's golden curls bounced as she rolled onto her back, laughing at the pup's antics. The other 4 dogs, Brutus, Sombra, Axel, and Khan, were stationed at various points in the house and yard. Their presence a quiet but powerful assurance of safety. Brutus, the largest and most experienced, lay near the front door, his ears twitching at every sound. His amber eyes reflected the firelight, but they remained trained on the entrance as though expecting something. Sombra, the quietest of the pack, was outside, patrolling the perimeter of the house with a grace that made his movements nearly invisible in the night. Axel and Khan, both massive and formidable, lounged near the back door, their bodies relaxed but their senses alert. They knew their duty: to protect, to guard, to stand as the first and last line of defense. Linda wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The fields stretched far beyond the house, an ocean of swaying shadows beneath the moonlight. The wind had picked up, its mournful whistle slithering through the cracks of the house. She shivered. It wasn't the cold that unsettled her. It was something else. A feeling, an intuition honed over decades of listening when others ignored. Frank's voice broke through her thoughts. "Something's off tonight," he said, not looking away from the darkness. She turned to him, the lines on her face deepening with worry. "You feel it too?" He gave a slow nod, taking a sip of coffee. "Dogs do too." Linda glanced at Brutus, whose ears were now pinned back slightly, his tail stiff. Axel and Khan were standing now, their massive heads turned toward the back door. Even Ghost had stopped playing, his tiny frame pressed against Lily as though seeking reassurance. A low growl rumbled from Brutus' throat. Frank set his mug down, the sound of ceramic against wood sharp in the tense silence. His hand drifted instinctively to the old revolver holstered at his side. Decades in the military had taught him to trust his instincts. And right now, every fiber of his being was on edge. The wind gusted harder, rattling the windows, making the house groan like an old ship on restless waters. Linda swallowed, her throat dry. "Maybe it's just a storm coming in," she suggested, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. Lily, sensing the shift in mood, sat up, her small hands wrapping around Ghost's fur. "Grandpa," her voice was soft, uncertain. Frank forced a smile, though his eyes remained vigilant. "It's all right, sweetheart. Just a quiet night." Brutus' growl deepened. Then, Sombra let out a sharp, warning bark from outside. Frank was on his feet in an instant, his body moving with a precision that belied his age. He reached for the shotgun mounted above the door, the familiar weight grounding him. Linda ushered Lily toward the kitchen, her voice gentle but firm. "Stay with me, baby." Axel and Khan moved toward the back door, their massive forms blocking the entrance as they bared their teeth. Their hackles raised. Brutus took his place beside Frank. Muscles coiled, ready. A noise, low, guttural, came from the fields. Not the wind. Not an animal. Something else. Sombra barked again, this time in warning rather than alarm. Whatever was out there, it was close. Too close. Frank exhaled slowly, steadying his grip on the shotgun. The shadows beyond the porch seemed to shift, moving with an unnatural fluidity. His heart pounded, but his hands remained steady. Linda clutched Lily tightly, whispering a silent prayer. Then, the night erupted. Sombra lunged from the darkness, his sleek body cutting through the air as he clamped his jaws onto something unseen. A shriek, inhuman, piercing, echoed through the night. Brutus bolted forward, joining the fight, his massive form disappearing into the darkness. Axel and Khan followed without hesitation, their powerful bodies crashing into whatever lurked beyond. Frank stepped onto the porch, shotgun raised, his breath slow and measured. "Stay inside," he ordered over his shoulder. Linda pulled Lily closer, heart hammering. "Frank, I know." Another shriek. Then silence. The wind howled, carrying the sound away. Frank exhaled, his grip tightening. The dogs were trained, disciplined. If the threat was eliminated, they'd return. A rustle, a shadow. Then, Brutus emerged, blood on his muzzle, his golden eyes fierce but calm. Axel and Khan flanked him, their bodies heaving with exertion but unharmed. Sombra limped slightly but held his head high. Ghost, too small to fight, had stayed behind, standing guard over Lily. Frank lowered the shotgun, his pulse still roaring in his ears. He stepped off the porch, scanning the fields. Whatever had been out there was gone. Or at least, driven back. He turned to the dogs. "Good boys." Brutus huffed, shaking out his fur. Frank walked back inside, locking the door behind him. Linda met his eyes, her face pale. "It's not over, is it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Lily, who still clung to Ghost. She had seen nothing, but she had felt it. The fear, the weight of something unseen. Frank walked to the fire, setting the shotgun down with a quiet clunk. He sat heavily in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. Outside, the wind continued to wail. And in the darkness beyond the fields, something watched, waiting. The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth, sending flickering shadows dancing across the walls of the old farmhouse. The warmth of the flames filled the room, contrasting with the bitter chill that clawed at the windows. Lily lay sprawled on the thick rug, her golden curls bouncing as she giggled, tugging at Ghost's floppy ears. The young pup wriggled excitedly, nipping at her fingers, his tiny tail wagging in delight. The other dogs lounged nearby, their massive forms at ease, muscles relaxed in the comfort of home. Then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. Brutus, the eldest and most experienced of the pack, lifted his massive head from his paws. His ears twitched, his dark eyes narrowing as he pushed himself up. Muscles taut beneath his thick coat. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he moved toward the front door, his lips curling back to reveal sharp white teeth. His posture was rigid, protective, as he planted himself firmly in front of the entrance. Sombra moved next, silent as a shadow, gliding across the room toward the window. His dark fur blended with the dim light as he pressed his nose to the glass, scanning the darkness beyond. His body was tense, motionless except for the occasional flick of his ears. Axel and Khan, the muscle of the pack, stood in unison. Their hackles bristled, deep guttural growls building in their throats. They moved as one, stepping toward the door, their bodies coiled like springs, ready to strike at whatever threat loomed beyond. Ghost, still young and unsure, whined softly and inched closer to Lily, pressing his small body against her side. His tiny frame trembled, ears pinned back. Lily's laughter faded. She sat up, her small hands tightening around Ghost's fur. "Grandpa," her voice was soft, uncertain. Frank Miller had felt it, too. He had been watching the fire, sipping his coffee, when the weight of the air around him changed. It wasn't something he could explain in words, just a feeling. A deep, primal sense of unease that coiled in his gut. The kind of feeling that had saved his life more times than he could count. The kind that told him something wasn't right. Slowly, he set his coffee down. The wooden chair creaked as he rose, his stiff joints protesting the movement. His gaze flicked to Linda, who had been clearing dishes in the kitchen. She had stopped mid-motion, a dish towel clenched in her hands. Her face pale. She felt it too. Frank's hand moved instinctively to the shotgun mounted above the door. His fingers wrapped around the cool metal, the weight of it familiar, reassuring. He had no reason to believe he would need it. No reason, except for the low growls of his dogs and the ice-cold feeling crawling up his spine. Then came the sound. It was subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind that whistled through the trees. A slow, deliberate scraping, fingernails, or claws, dragging across wood. The dogs reacted instantly. Brutus' growl deepened, his body rigid. Sombra remained at the window, his breath fogging the glass as his eyes locked onto something unseen. Axel and Khan tensed, muscles coiling, their tails stiff. Even Ghost whimpered, pressing himself tighter against Lily. Linda's hand flew to her mouth, her breath quickening. "Frank!" He silenced her with a look. His pulse was steady, trained by years of discipline. But there was no denying the creeping dread that curled in his chest. Slowly, carefully, he moved toward the door, his boots making no sound against the wooden floorboards. He adjusted his grip on the shotgun, his thumb brushing over the safety. The scraping sound came again, longer this time, more deliberate. Frank swallowed. He had heard many things in his lifetime: gunfire, explosions, the last breaths of dying men, but this sound unnerved him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't an animal. He had lived on this land long enough to know the sounds of wolves, of coyotes, of bears. This was different. Reaching the door, he paused. Every instinct screamed at him not to open it. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to peer through the narrow window beside the frame. Nothing. Just darkness. The endless stretch of fields beyond the yard. The silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. The moonlight cast long shadows, shifting and twisting as the breeze passed through. But the feeling remained, the undeniable sense that something, someone, was out there, watching. He listened. The wind rustled the dry leaves. The old house creaked in protest against the night's chill. The dog's breathing was heavy, controlled, waiting for his command. Then, silence. A silence so complete, so unnatural, that it made his skin crawl. Linda stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Frank, what do you see?" He hesitated before answering. "Nothing." But that was a lie. Because he saw movement, just beyond the tree line. In the farthest reaches of the yard. A shifting shadow. Too quick, too fluid to be the wind. It was there for only a moment, just long enough to register, before melting into the darkness. Brutus let out a single, sharp bark. Frank stiffened. The sound of footsteps, faint, deliberate, moving along the side of the house. Linda took a step back, her breath coming fast. Lily clutched Ghost tighter, eyes wide. Frank moved swiftly, motioning for Linda to take Lily to the kitchen. "Stay put," he ordered. She hesitated but nodded, scooping up their granddaughter and retreating. The firelight flickered against the walls, casting deep shadows across the room. Frank took a breath, steadying himself, then reached for the doorknob. He turned it slowly, the metal cool beneath his touch. The hinges groaned softly as the door creaked open. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. The yard was empty, or so it seemed. The trees swayed, their branches whispering against one another. The porch light cast a weak glow, barely illuminating the front steps. Frank stepped out onto the porch, shotgun raised. His boots made soft thuds against the warm wood. Brutus followed, his body tense, ears pricked forward. Nothing, but the feeling remained, that oppressive, suffocating sense of being watched. He scanned the tree line, every nerve on edge. Then, a sound. Not the wind, Not the trees. A whisper. Low. Faint. His finger tightened on the trigger. A shift in the shadows. A flash of movement. And then, nothing. The night swallowed whatever had been there. Frank stood still, breath visible in the cold air. His heart pounded in his chest. Steady but hard. Brutus took a step forward. Nose in the air, sniffing. His ears twitched. A low rumble built in his throat. Frank exhaled, backing toward the door. Whatever it was, it wasn't gone, just waiting. He stepped inside, locking the door behind him. Linda's eyes met his. Frank? He shook his head. Not yet. The fire crackled. The wind howled. And outside, something listened. The night outside was suffocating. Thick with an unnatural stillness that made every breath feel heavy. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, its glow barely reaching the edges of the dimly lit room. Frank stood near the door, shotgun in hand, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm. The wind had died down, replaced by an eerie silence that made his skin crawl. Then, it came, a howl, long, deep, and unnatural, ripped through the night, carrying across the empty fields like a whisper from something ancient. It was not the call of a wolf, nor the cry of any animal Frank had ever known. It was something else, something wrong. The sound circled the house, moving too fast, too fluidly, as though the very air carried it. Brutus snarled, stepping forward, his body rigid, muscles coiled. Axel and Khan flanked him, their growls rolling through the house like distant thunder. Sombra remained by the window, ears pinned back, eyes locked on the darkness beyond. Ghost whimpered, pressing himself against Lily's side, his small frame trembling violently. Then another howl, this time closer. It wasn't alone. Lily clutched Ghost tighter, her tiny hands twisting into his fur. Her breath was shallow, fast. She turned her wide, frightened eyes to Frank. "Grandpa," she whispered. Frank turned toward her, the lines of his face deepening with worry. "It's all right, sweetheart," he said, though he knew it was a lie. Then she whispered something that sent ice through his veins. "It knows my name." Frank felt his blood run cold. Linda let out a soft gasp, clutching at Lily's shoulders. Outside, the wind picked up again. But this time it wasn't natural. It moved in bursts, gusts slamming against the walls like fists. Then the door shook. Hard. Linda jumped back, covering Lily's head with her hands. The wooden frame groaned under the force, the hinges rattling as if something massive was pressing against it. The dogs erupted. Axel and Khan lunged toward the door, their snarls turning into full-throated roars. Brutus planted himself in front of it, his teeth bared, his entire body a wall of muscle and fury. Sombra darted from the window to the entrance, his movements swift, calculated. Frank took a slow step back, his grip tightening on the shotgun. "We need to leave," he said, his voice steady despite the dread curling in his chest. Another slam. The entire house shook. Lily whimpered. Linda grabbed Frank's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Frank, we can't stay here." He nodded. There was no choice. Whatever was out there was getting bolder. Frank bent down, scooping Lily into his arms. "Hold on tight," he told her. She buried her face in his shoulder, her little fingers gripping his jacket. Linda was already moving toward the back door. But the dogs didn't follow. Brutus, Axel, and Khan stood firm, their eyes locked on something beyond the door. Frank hesitated. "Brutus, come on, boy." The old dog didn't move. Neither did the others. Instead, they turned slightly, looking at him, at Lily. And Frank understood. They weren't leaving. They were staying to fight. Linda tugged at his arm. "Frank, we have to go." Regret hit him like a punch to the chest. But he knew better than to hesitate. He turned, rushing toward the back door. Sombra and Ghost followed, slipping out into the cold night with them. The wind hit them instantly, biting through their clothes, howling through the fields. Frank ran. His boots pounded against the earth as he raced toward the truck. Linda was right behind him, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Sombra was at his side, moving like a shadow, ears flat, eyes constantly scanning the darkness. Ghost whined, keeping pace, his tiny legs working frantically to stay close. Frank threw open the truck door and shoved Lily inside. Climbing in after her, Linda yanked the passenger door open, fumbling with her seatbelt. Then Frank looked back. The farmhouse stood against the dark, the windows flickering with firelight. The front door splintered, and for the first time, Frank saw it. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, stood at the edge of the tree line. Its limbs were long, too long, its silhouette twisting unnaturally. It wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that should not exist. Frank barely had time to register the sight before Brutus and the others attacked. The door burst open. The dogs lunged into the darkness. The thing did not move. Then the truck roared to life. Frank slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching. The truck lurched forward, speeding down the dirt road, away from the house, away from whatever horror lurked behind them. Lily sobbed into his shoulder. Linda clutched the dashboard, her eyes locked on the rearview mirror. Sombra sat in the truck bed, his body braced, his eyes glowing in the reflection of the taillights. Ghost curled against Lily, shaking uncontrollably. No one spoke. Not until they hit the main road. Not until the house disappeared into the blackness. Not until the howling finally stopped. Frank gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He did not look back. He did not need to. Because he knew. Brutus, Axel, and Khan were gone. And whatever had come for them was still out there, waiting. The truck barreled down the darkened road, its tires kicking up loose gravel as Frank gripped the wheel with white-knuckled intensity. The headlights cut a narrow path through the endless stretch of asphalt. But beyond the glow, the night remained vast, suffocating. Linda held Lily close in the passenger seat, whispering reassurances that rang hollow even to her own ears. Sombra crouched low in the truck bed, his ears pinned back, his golden eyes locked on the darkness rushing past them. Frank's pulse pounded in his ears. He should have felt safer, putting distance between them and whatever had stood outside the house. whatever had worn Brutus' face. But the sickening weight in his chest only grew heavier. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. Too fast. Too smooth. Something was running alongside the truck. His gut clenched. His fingers tightened around the wheel as he stole a glance at the side mirror. There it was. A shape. Long and lean. Moving in the darkness beyond the road's edge. It wasn't just running. It was keeping pace with them. Matching their speed effortlessly. Its limbs moved in a way that defied nature. Shifting between 2 legs and 4. Its body contorting with an unnatural grace. It was almost human. Almost canine. But neither description fit. And then, as if sensing his gaze, it looked at him. Frank's breath hitched. Its head twisted, craning back in an impossible angle to meet his stare. Its mouth was stretched wide in a grin too large, too full of teeth, its eyes gleaming with something cold, something ancient. It was playing with them. Frank swallowed hard and pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The engine roared in protest. But the truck surged forward. The thing laughed. Not a growl, not a snarl, a sound that mimicked human laughter, low, breathy, laced with something wrong. Sombra's growl vibrated through the truck bed. Low and warning. Ghost let out a sharp, terrified yelp from the backseat. Pressing himself against Lily, his tiny body trembling. Then, from behind them, another sound cut through the night. A furious, primal bark. Brutus. And then Axel. Then Khan. The barking grew into a savage, deafening chorus, filled with rage and warning. The thing beside them faltered, its twisted limbs jerking as it turned its attention toward the sound. Frank risked another glance in the mirror. 3 massive figures exploded from the tree line, their powerful bodies charging straight toward the thing in the dark. Their eyes burned with fury. Their teeth flashed in the moonlight. Brutus, Axel, Khan. Frank clenched his jaw. His boys hadn't been left behind. They had stayed to fight. The thing let out an unnatural, screeching howl, a noise that sent chills rippling down Frank's spine. Then it twisted, leaping toward them. Brutus hit first. The impact sent both bodies tumbling into the undergrowth. The other 2 followed, lunging with terrifying speed, teeth flashing, snarls splitting the night. Then, silence. The trees swallowed them whole. Frank forced his eyes back to the road. His chest tight. The guilt clawed at him. But there was nothing he could do now. They had given him a chance to get away. To keep his family safe. But at what cost? Up ahead, in the distance, a neon glow pierced the darkness. A gas station. Frank barely processed the sight before his foot instinctively eased off the pedal. The sign flickered weakly, casting a dull yellow light over the otherwise desolate stretch of road. The parking lot was empty. The buildings small and isolated. A lone beacon in the empty night. Relief battled against dread in his gut. Frank. Linda breathed, her voice tight. We can't stop. He exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening. We don't have a choice. The truck rumbled into the lot, tires crunching against the loose gravel. Frank barely shifted into park before throwing open the door. His boots hit the ground hard. the cold air biting against his skin. He scanned the tree line, his heart hammering, waiting, watching. Linda pulled Lily out of the truck, holding her close as she hurried toward the station. Sombra leapt from the truck bed, landing silently beside Frank, his gaze never leaving the road they had come from. Frank listened, but the only sound was the soft hum of the neon sign. His throat tightened. The barking was gone. Brutus, Axel, Khan, they hadn't followed. His boys, his protectors, were still out there, fighting, dying. His jaw clenched. His fingers twitched over the shotgun still slung across his chest. Frank. Linda's voice was barely a whisper. He turned. She stood in the glow of the gas station's light. Lily clutched against her side. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "They're not coming, are they?" she asked. Frank swallowed hard. He wanted to lie, wanted to tell her they were just a little behind, that they would come sprinting up the road any second now. But he couldn't, because he knew the truth. The thing in the woods hadn't come alone. And now, it had his boys. Sombra let out a low, warning growl. Then the howling started again. Not far, not distant, but close. Too close. Frank forced himself to move, grabbing Linda's arm and pulling her toward the gas station door. Lily whimpered against her chest, tiny fingers digging into her mother's jacket. Ghost let out a frightened whine. Frank reached for the door handle. And then he heard it. A scratch. Slow, deliberate. Right behind him. He froze. The air felt thick, heavy with something unseen. A low breath rasped just over his shoulder. He turned, and met Brutus' eyes. His body stood just feet away, illuminated in the neon glow. His fur was matted with dirt. His chest heaving. Blood, not his, dripped from his muzzle. But his eyes weren't right. Too dark, too empty. Linda's breath caught. Her grip on Lily tightened. Frank took a step back, his fingers twitching over the shotgun. Brutus didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe, just watched. Then, a sound, soft, almost playful, slithered from his throat. A chuckle. Not a growl, not a whine, a laugh. Frank's stomach dropped. And in the distance, hidden within the darkness just beyond the neon's reach, more figures stood, tall, watching, smiling. The hunt wasn't over. It had only just begun. The truck sat idling on the side of the road, its headlights carving weak tunnels of light through the endless Montana darkness. Frank's hands remained clenched around the steering wheel, his breath slow and measured, though his pulse was anything but. The cold night pressed in around them, the silence heavier than it should have been. They had escaped, hadn't they? Lily whimpered softly in the backseat, curled into Linda's arms, her tiny body trembling. Sombra and Ghost sat rigid beside her, their eyes locked on the road behind them, ears pricked forward, listening, waiting. Frank swallowed against the tightness in his throat. His mind reeled, a storm of guilt and dread raging in his chest. He had left them, Brutus, Axel, Khan, his loyal protectors, his boys. He had abandoned them to fight against something they should never have had to face. He exhaled shakily. Then he saw it. A shadow moving in the distance. At first, it was just a flicker, something shifting along the edge of the tree line. But then, it stepped forward, into the dim wash of the truck's taillights. A dog. Large. Muscular. Brutus. Frank's breath caught in his throat. The old shepherd moved slowly. His powerful frame covered in dirt and matted fur. His chest rose and fell in uneven gasps. His paws dragging slightly against the ground. The deep gashes across his flank glistened with fresh blood. But he remained standing, unbroken, staring at the truck with those familiar amber eyes. But something was wrong. Frank could feel it in his bones. Brutus had survived. Somehow, against all odds, he had made it out. But as he took another step forward, Frank's stomach twisted into a hard knot of unease. The way Brutus moved, too stiff, too deliberate. The way his breath hitched, as if struggling against something unseen. And the eyes. Linda gasped softly beside him, her fingers gripping his sleeve. "Frank," she whispered, voice trembling. He didn't look at her. He couldn't, because she saw it, too. Brutus' eyes weren't the same. The warm, intelligent amber that had always burned in his gaze was gone. Something else had taken its place. The pupils were too large, swallowing what little color remained. There was no recognition, no relief, no exhaustion from the battle he had just fought. Instead, there was something cold, something vacant, something watching. Frank felt a chill run through his spine, deeper than the night air. His grip tightened on the shotgun resting across his lap. "Brutus," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The dog didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, breathing too hard, too loud in the quiet. A single drop of blood slid from his muzzle, landing soundlessly in the dirt. Linda's hand found Frank's shoulder, squeezing tight. "Are you sure?" Her voice broke. "Are you sure that's our Brutus?" Frank couldn't answer, because in truth, he wasn't sure of anything anymore. A low growl rumbled from the backseat. Sombra had risen, his body tense, every muscle locked. His fur bristled along his spine. His lips peeled back over his teeth. Not in recognition, but in warning. Ghost, the smallest of them all, let out a soft, frightened whimper, pressing himself against Lily as if trying to shield her from something she could not see. Frank's throat tightened. His boys had always been a unit, one mind, one pack. If Sombra didn't trust Brutus, if he saw something unnatural, something wrong, then Frank had to believe him. But how could he turn away? How could he leave Brutus behind again? Another step. Brutus was closer now, just feet from the truck. And then, from somewhere deep in the darkness beyond the road, the howling began again. Not wolf, not coyote, not anything natural. It rose like a chorus, winding through the trees in sickening harmony. Voices that weren't human, weren't animal, but something caught between the two. Something that had followed them. Something that had come with him. Brutus' ears twitched, his head tilted ever so slightly. And he smiled. Frank's breath left his lungs in a sharp exhale. It was impossible, wrong, a grotesque imitation of something familiar. A twitch of the lips. The faintest curl at the edges of his mouth, unnatural in a way that sent every instinct in Frank's body screaming. Linda sucked in a sharp breath, her nails digging into Frank's arm. Lily whimpered. Ghost trembled. Sombra snarled. Frank forced himself to move. With a steady hand, he reached down and shifted the truck into gear. Brutus stepped closer. Frank's foot hovered over the gas pedal. His pulse thundered in his ears. Brutus took another step. Then another. And then, Frank floored it. The tires screeched, kicking up a spray of dirt and gravel. The truck lurched forward, its headlights slicing through the darkness as it roared down the empty road. Linda let out a choked sob. Lily curled into a ball, her face buried against Ghost's fur. Frank didn't look back. Not at Brutus. Not at the thing that wore his skin. Not at the shadows shifting in the trees. Keeping pace with the truck. Whispering his granddaughter's name. The road stretched endlessly ahead. A narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through an ocean of black. The howling never stopped. It followed them, weaving through the night like a promise. A warning. A hunt that had just begun.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.